Hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and we'll quickly get to the title of this video and how it is a total lie. But this is my very favourite brush. It began life in a year with a lot more nines in as a square brush grateful canvas painting. Over the years it lost its square and became a great dry brush. Then it's lost its bristles and I tore open the ferrule down to the crimp to get a bit more brush out of it. I used it for wiping up dust off of my bases at one point, which led to it getting superglue in the bristles. And recently I've been treating it ever more harshly and it's starting to shed, and so this might just be the swan song piece for this brush. But just because it's in terrible shape doesn't mean it's useless. In fact, it is entirely useful still. Most of the model I'll be painting today will be painted with this brush. This is a model from Wargame 3D, who now have quite a wide selection of World War II vehicles, but specifically this is the Auto Blindo 1941, or Armoured Car in Italian. Now whilst Wargame 3D did send me the STLs for this file, it was for the Cromwell video and not this one, and so I just wanted to make sure that was clear before we continue. The AB-41 has some pretty distinct features, such as a rear-facing hull machine gun. And as you might already be able to tell, this is the point where we admit the video title is a lie. I've already base coated the whole thing with the airbrush and not with our tired old stipple brush. The turret is attached in an odd way, and that's because my 3D printer has the habit of oversizing things. The turret peg ended up too tight and I snapped it off. To fix this, I used a screw and a single magnet so that the turret at least holds in place, even if it doesn't turn in quite the way it should. Right, let's grab my half-dead brush and get started with the main technique that I'll use on this model. And that technique is called modulation, and I hope my regular viewers can forgive me for explaining this again, but instead of highlighting based on a light source, for example, the sun above would mean the upper facing parts of a model would be lighter, modulation uses the lighter and darker paints to frame each part or each module of the model to make them more visually distinct. Because I've base coated the armoured car in a dark brown, I'm stippling some slightly lighter brown onto the middle of every armour panel, and I'm kind of covering most of each panel at this stage, leaving just a thin dark frame of that original brown for each module. For this whole process I'm only using two paints, that original dark brown and a lighter ochre paint. This first mix is still mostly the dark brown with only a little ochre mixed in, but the next layer I'll add some more ochre and then several more layers, and eventually I'm only going to be using the ochre paint for the bright centre part of each panel. As I said, each layer is focused on the middle of each panel, but where I get closer to the edges I'm not paying much mind to how well it's covered. What that means is that when I get to my last layers, the middle has pretty solid coat of mostly that brightest paint, the ochre, but around the edges there's lots and lots of specks of every single layer, every mix of paints, which leads to that colour having somewhat of a messy gradient from the bright colour in most of the middle of the panel to the dark brown at the very edge. And currently this looks pretty horrible. Stippling leaves quite that visual texture which doesn't really work on this type of model, but later on I'll be using a dark wash to smooth all of that out. But before then I want to do a few other things, as just this armour colour would be a little boring. But for those details I'm going to swap to a finer pointed brush. Cheating, I know. I mixed a dark grey for the tyres and the machine gun, and there's a grille on the back as well. I saw in some of the pictures the exhaust can sometimes have a browny red colour, which is a nice bit of colour, but the real splash of colour that I'll put on this model is the Italian flag on the side. Now I don't use masking tape very often, but this is the perfect time to get a nice sharp edge. White paint is notorious for covering badly, so I painted it grey first and then white over the top, and given the grey and white that I use, this actually does cover in not a lot of layers. And I let that dry before I put some more masking tape on for the smaller stripes, which I'll put in the red and green. Now unfortunately my nice bright primary red and green paints both I accidentally bought them as gloss paints, and that really doesn't behave nicely, and it took quite a few layers to get a decent coat out of them. Now you're probably complaining that I'm using the wrong brush for this. All of this detail work can't really be done with a stipple brush, but once I was done with the billion layers to get the flag the right colours, I went back to my stippling brush to just hide the corners and the edges of the flag, just by stippling some of that dark brown around the edge. In honesty, this covers quite a lot more of the flag than I had intended, but it does the job. And this is just because the flag had come out fairly poorly due to the gloss paints, and stippling over the top makes it look like the paint of the flag had worn away to the brown paint underneath. Now with all of those details in place, I can finally get that wash going down, which will bring all of these messy parts of the model into one whole. Now you might expect that I'd use a brown wash on my brown vehicle, but I really want to push this into a dark overall tone in the end, and so I went with a black wash instead. Just a thin coat over the whole model, but I did add a little bit extra where there are recesses, like on the vents, the wheels, the vision ports, and that's so hopefully in the end I get a little bit of a panel line effect without actually having to do any panel lining. After the wash has dried, you can see that all of that messy stippling has been brought together, and the modulation for each armor panel has taken effect, even though it is very dark. Each of the armor panels has a slightly brighter middle over kind of most of the armor panel, and then it's framed in that darker shade around the edges where I left the original base coat. And the one last step here I want to do is just to emphasize the shape of the vehicle, that last little bit, by going over all of the main edges to bring out the silhouette. And that's just classic edge highlighting using the same ochre paint that I used before. Now I don't tend to like mentioning how long it takes to paint models. Speed has become a bit of an obsession in the mini painting community, and it really shouldn't be. But in this case, I will tell you that it took me an afternoon to paint this model, just 2 or 3 hours, from going from the airbrush to having the model done, and that wasn't even with me rushing. It's just because this painting style is so very simple and easy, and it lets you be quite messy throughout the whole process. Now of course you can be a lot more careful with this type of thing. I sort of wanted to push the point by using this terrible brush, but I hope that puts it into context of just how much effort this kind of technique would really take. So what do you think at home? Are we ready for my stippling brush to have a Viking funeral? Should I buy a new brush and kind of do it all again for the next 10 years? And probably more importantly, what do you think of this armoured car that I painted? For such an easy paint scheme, I'm actually really happy with how it came out. My slowly expanding Italian force will make good use of it. But for now, I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.